Thank you for tuning in to
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Welcome to the podcast. And now,
our final stretch, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson is our guest. We're looking at Tisha B'Av and what we should be commemorating and some of the things that we should really be thinking about on this a very, very sad day on the Jewish calendar, which, as we said at the beginning, it has all elements of positivity. It's going to be called a holiday. But right now we have to live, I guess, with the fact that it's a mourning day, a very, very sad day on the Jewish calendar. Maybe, Rabbi Jacobson, you get lots of different questions from different people. What's some of the common questions you've gotten regarding Tisha B'Av?
I was once speaking to a group of teenagers. It was during the 9 days. You can hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can. Go ahead. Yes. Uh-huh.
And they were very perturbed by the fact that they couldn't eat meat. They wanted to eat meat. They wanted to have some rib steak. And this was an Orthodox Jewish camp. And they couldn't eat meat. They were very upset. And, one of the boys, smart kid, he's like, I don't understand. This thing happened 1,900 years ago. And yes, it's sad and it's tragic. But why in the world, in the 21st century, I want to eat a piece of steak? I want to drink a cup of wine. Why do I have to suffer? What's the logic here? It just makes me miserable. It makes me feel like I don't like this whole religion. This is what he's sharing. And it was certainly an interesting question to ponder because, for all of us who grew up in camp, we always knew the 9 days were always difficult days, right? We didn't go swimming, and there were no trips, and they had to invent all these types of entertainments, and of course the music stopped playing in camp. It was just an element of a somber, solemn element. And as kids, you go away this summer, you want to have fun. It's like, why do we have to bear the burdens? Like, not enough Jewish suffering.
I think purposely the 9 days and the 3 weeks are in the summertime. It's not any other time. I think it's made because summertime people are more into frivolous activities and going away. So maybe it's to bring a somber note during this time period.
Right. Yeah. So as somebody once told me, we finally have a few weeks in the summer.
Right.
We could relax. They had to ruin that. So I looked at these kids and I said, it's a good question. It's an important question. And I'm just going to share with you one thought. And I saw that it resonated. It resonated with them. And I said, listen, I just want you to understand what we're doing right now. We live almost 2,000 years later, literally. What happened over the last 2,000 years? What happened? Everything changed. I mean, the changes in terms of civilization on our planet in the last 2,000 years were incredible. Because the changes in the last 100 years are mind-boggling. Never mind the last 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years. America is a few hundred years old. French Revolution, a few hundred years. And you're dealing here with a people that's thousands of years old. And I said, listen, we could ignore what happened, and we can eat meat, and we can drink wine, and we can take haircuts, and we can enjoy water sports and so forth. But I want you to know the gift you would be giving up. The gift that you would be giving up is a link to a story that began 4,000 years ago, and it's still going strong. You could look at yourself as an isolated young man or woman growing up in the United States of America, trying to create a life for yourself. Or you could see yourself in the context of an eternal and timeless people that for thousands of years has survived through thick and thin, through every conceivable crisis and tragedy, and yet emerged with strong families and a strong identity and strong values, with a vision to transform the landscape of planet Earth, literally, to fill this world with divine awareness like the water covers the sea. A nation that in every generation attracted the hate and the venom of the most evil and heinous dictators, tyrants, despots, cruel monarchs and governors, as it still attracts the venom of those people, whether in Iran or Syria or Afghanistan or Pakistan, etc., Gaza. tells you about the power of this people, the sacredness of the people, the holiness of the people. A people that literally in every generation stood at the forefront of the moral voice, the moral conversation, leading and inspiring the moral conversation of mankind. And I said, I look at this custom not to eat meat as basically a statement. We're not living in a vacuum. We are continuing a story. The Jews who were murdered 2,000 years ago are living in us. They're living in our shuls, in our study halls, in our homes, in our minds, in our texts, in our conversations. And during those 9 days, when they were slain mercilessly, I could make believe like nothing happened. It's 2,000 years comfortably in America. We can all eat steak with ketchup and French fries and add some sushi and a cup of wine. But I say, you know what? I would prefer to say, no, these 9 days are meaningful to me because when my ancestors suffered so much during these 9 days, I'm alive, thank God we're alive. But you know what? I won't touch that piece of steak just to pay tribute to all those Jews and say that I will continue their story. And I said, I think that powerful connection, it's worth to maintain it, even if I have to sacrifice a rib steak for supper.
Now,
you know what?
And what did they say?
They were like, their applause. They gave me such an applause, and I realized, Herman Wouk. You remember Herman Wouk, the late...
Sure, the great writer.
Yeah, right. So Herman Wouk in the 1950s once tells Lubavitcher Rebbe, of blessed memory, to Lubavitcher Rebbe, I'm listening to your vision for American Jews. Do you think you're dreaming? Do you think you can tell American Jews to do anything? This is the 1950s. And the Rebbe tells them, Mr. Wouk, he said, American youth, you can't tell them to do anything. You can explain to them to do everything. And I realized that when we speak to the souls of our children, they get it. I could have told them, you're just a bunch of spoiled brats. This is the law in Shulchan Aruch, and just listen to your elders and stop asking stupid, bratty, narcissistic questions. And then they would have said, okay, another one, another rabbi who doesn't understand us. But when I spoke to their souls, to their idealism, they were in. They got it. It was very moving for me to see that.
Tell me, in the few moments we have remaining, is I know that we carry the Siyum every day from the National Committee for the Furtherance of Jewish Education, but from what I understand, Lubavitch is not big in having meat Siyum, where you have here a Siyum and eat meat. Because you can do it. You can do it every day. I mean, you can have a Siyum and have meat every day. So there's a way of getting around it.
I live here in Muncie, and I have two neighbors, and they made a Siyum on different nights, and they had huge parties with meat and wine. It happens to be that the custom of the fifth Chabad Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Shalom Ber Shneis, and the Rebbe Rashab, he died in 1920, he had a custom of making a Siyum every night, but he still would not eat meat and wine. This was his stringency that became part of Chabad tradition. But that's just a particular stringency. Halachically, you're allowed to eat meat. And that's what they do in many camps and in many communities.
Right. So maybe the solution the point is that you're teaching them a lesson. That's what you're trying to teach them.
I would say they have a lesson. That's number one. And number two, it's the idea that even when they're eating meat with a Siyum, they're eating meat because, in a way, that Siyum, the fact that they finished a tractate of Gemara, is really the defeat of the destruction. It's the defeat of Rome. It's the defeat of Babylonia. The fact that Jews are learning Gemara today. What are the chances, right? An Aramaic text composed 1,700 years ago. The syntax, the structure, the grammar, the language, the style, completely alien to the sensibilities and to the flavors and to the laws of literature and the styles of literature of the 21st century. And yet thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews pick up the text and they discuss it and they learn it and they argue and they ask and they answer and they finish it and they make a siyum. That itself represents Netzach Yisrael, the eternity of Israel, and the defeat of those forces that undermine and destroy the Beis HaMikdash. The Talmud says in Gittin that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the leading sage of the time, he met Vespasian. And Vespasian was impressed by him, and he asked him what he would like as a favor. And Rabbi Yochanan asked him three things: a doctor for Reb Tzadok, and to spear the dynasty of Ram Gamliel, and also to spear the city of Yavne, where there was the yeshiva, the Sanhedrin, the yeshiva. And people were critical of him, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yosef. They said, you should have asked him for the temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai thought that would be ineffective, so he just asked him for Yavna. But one of the fascinating things is that through that, really, Rome signed its own death certificate. Vespasian didn't realize that by giving Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai permission to keep the Torah alive in Yavna, he was guaranteeing the timeless eternity of the Jewish people. So this very same man who burned Jerusalem, Vespasian and his son Titus, who did everything we're mourning today, came from Vespasian and Titus. He was the same man who also ultimately wrote the death sentence of the Roman Empire and the certificate of survival for the Jewish people.
Except they reneged on it. They reneged on it because they tried to eradicate the study of Torah by 60 years later. That's what led to the Bar Kokhba revolt, where they revolted against the excesses of the Roman barbarism, but also stopping. So they went back on it.
Exactly. That the Talmud says that Sanhedrin had to move into 10 different locations, go into exile, and ultimately it was dissolved. But obviously the learning was not. And the fact is, that it's really incredible. It's incredible. Rabbi Akiva was murdered. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was murdered. Literally, Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol was murdered. Rabbi Hanina ben Chadian was murdered. Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, the 10. And yet we learn their teachings. Rabbi Akiva's ideas are on the lips of every Jewish child.
It means which means he's still alive. He's still alive. Rabbi, we're out of time, so we appreciate your really being with, giving us some great insight into Tisha B'Av. People can go to the yeshiva.net.
Thank you. My honor and privilege.
And
my honor and privilege. And may we spoke about the seeds of redemption. So the birth of Mashiach on Tisha B'Av. So after so many years, may we experience that birth in a very real and vivid way, personally and cosmically.
Amen, amen. Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, noted R-rated scholar, and you can catch him at yeshiva.net.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast, on the air since 1981.
And now your host.
It's Tisha B'Av night, and we want to explore the deeper meaning of Tisha B'Av. What does it mean in today's contemporary world and society, where we have, thank God, a state of Israel, but we also have challenging anti-Semitism, Jew hatred? Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson is a noted scholar, educator, and he is sought after the world, and that's why we invite him to join us on this special Tisha B'Av broadcast. So, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, noted educator, speaker, lecturer, we appreciate you being here with us. What goes through your mind?
Thank you.
Why is this Tisha B'Av different? This, I guess, the first Tisha B'Av that's post-COVID, so I think it's probably people are getting back to some sense of normal, but it's not really the same way that it was pre-COVID.
Right, for sure. Last Tisha B'Av was unique because as the opening of the Book of Lamentations, which we just read tonight, Eicha Yashva Vadad Ha'ira Basiyam, those moving words of Jeremiah that he wrote during the destruction of the first temple. Alas, how a city flooded with people, flooded with so many Jews, pulsating with so much vibrancy. It's badad, it's lonely, it's alone. Certainly last year there was a lot of loneliness. This year, I think, thank God, a lot of communities are coming back together, not everywhere, but in my neck of the woods, a lot of people were there tonight for Ma'ariv and Eicha. But I think that the concept of loneliness that he speaks about is really something that describes one of the most powerful ideas of the day, and that is that Judaism, Jewish theology, Jewish law, gave the Jewish people a day in which we literally dedicate the day to respect and to embrace and to show compassion for our pain, for our brokenness, for our traumas, individually and collectively. There's two schools of thought. One school of thought says, just move on with life, put one foot ahead of the other foot, and put a smile on your face and be productive and don't dwell on the pain. And then there's a different philosophy in life. No, get into the pain and figure it out so that you could spit it out. And I think Tisha B'Av teaches us something very powerful. That's maybe one of the key points in Jewish resilience. We dedicate a full day in which we honor the fact that there's brokenness, in which we're encouraged to cry, to weep, to mourn, to grieve, to be able to grieve for things that we dreamt about, for dreams shattered, for lives lost, for innocence taken from us, each in their own individual, every person with their own pain, every family with their own pain, and collectively with our pain. And then a day after Tisha B'Av, we say, and now we go back to rebuilding a fractured world. And we do this every single year. It's a very powerful testimony to the human spirit that it's important to be able to spend one full day, 24 hours, literally dedicated to the tears and to the pain of people. You have to have compassion for it, you have to respect it, you have to process it, and you have to be able to sit with it. Be able to sit with that part of us that's Eicha Yashva Vada, that's lonely. And then from that place, we can look into that pain and say, together with this pain, we believe in the unshakable eternity of goodness and of the power of the soul.
As you were speaking, Rabbi Jacobson, I was just thinking how it's not only the day after, but even on Tisha B'Av itself. Here you are, halachic chatzos, halachic midday is, let's say, it's 1 o'clock today. And here you are, you're not supposed to be sitting on a chair, you're mourning. Then all of a sudden, 1 minute later, comes 1 o'clock, you're allowed to sit on a chair, you have some aspects of a moed, you don't say tachnu, you can put on talis and film. It's within the same day of the greatest despair, there's also the seeds of great hope. And it changes just like that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, Zev, that, this really embodies, Mark Twain asked that famous question, what happened to the Egyptian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Greek, Roman empires that have all been relegated to the dustbin of history, and the tiny Jewish nation survives, outlives them all, and thrives despite our challenges, despite our problems, which are serious. And I think this juxtaposition, this fusion of two realities that we live with, and we don't try to amputate one of them. The very same day when we sit on the ground, put ashes on our head, dim the lights, and explore thousands of years of pain, bloodshed, suffering, and destruction, we then rise up again. We declare Nachem, and as the Talmud puts it, the Talmud says an unbelievable story in Jerusalem Talmud tractate, Ta'anit, that there was a Jew plowing his field in the land of Israel on the 9th of Av, on the day of the destruction. And there was a Bedouin Arab who understood the language of animals. And when this Jew's ox grunted, the Bedouin said, "Stop plowing your field because your temple has just been destroyed." A moment later, the ox gave another grunt and he said, "You could resume your plowing because your Mashiach was just born." And what does that really mean? What does that really mean? Of course, this Talmudic story became the central point in the great debate between Nachmanides Ramban and his student, the Jewish apostate Pablo Cristiani in the 1260s in Spain. You see when the Messiah was born, of course, but that's a different subject, fascinating subject as is. But the great mystics pointed out over the generations that the Jewish people understood that the seeds of redemption lay and are impregnated in the very darkness of exile. In other words, every crisis is also an opportunity. It doesn't eliminate the pain of the crisis, but when one window closes, one door closes, another one opens. The Jews had the ability to be able to say, we may not always know why, and we certainly feel the pain, but we always know that there's some hidden light and opportunity to explore so that we can create a rebirth, a rejuvenation from that crisis. I always say that in China, they say, why are the Chinese around for 5,000 years? Because in China, the same character they use for crisis is the same character they use for opportunity. But in Hebrew, it's much better. The word we use for a breakdown is called mashber, from the word shvira, brokenness, fractured, mashber. When somebody has a breakdown, they say he had a mashber. It's the same word that the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, uses for a woman giving birth. Yoshevet al hamashber, the birthing stool, is called a mashber. Because in Judaism, every time we're broken, it's not just to break us. It's because brokenness allows a deeper awareness, a deeper light to come in. The cracks are what allow the light to come in. So therefore, as you said, on the very same day of destruction, we also feel and experience the birth of a new reality, of a renaissance, of a rejuvenation. And Zev, if you study Jewish history, I always tell this to my students, it's an unbelievable fact. Look at every one of the darkest periods of Jewish history and you'll see that it was followed by an incredible outburst of creativity of the highest caliber. For example, take the destruction of the first temple. Today it's hard for us to understand, that in the year 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed the temple and decimated the first Jewish commonwealth, the crisis was unprecedented. It's the first time since Moses, Jews don't have a land. They don't have a temple. They don't have an epicenter. And that's when they imagine the concept of a shul. There's no concept of a shul till then. It was Ezekiel who witnessed the destruction. He is the one who in his book, Yecheskel, introduces Mikdash Ma'at, the miniature sanctuary. And the Jews then developed the idea that God could be found wherever we let him in. And they started to create gatherings dedicated to prayer, to learning, to helping people, which today became the immortal institution of the Jewish shul, the Beis HaKnesses, the Beis HaMedrash, the yeshiva, the Jewish community center where we gather. The idea that divinity is not relegated to one geographic location. This came at the heels of horrible, horrible tragedy. The destruction of the second temple, which till the Holocaust was the worst calamity that could befall the Jewish people. And suddenly, right after that, nobody understands even why, how, and why. You have the explosion of what we call today Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral tradition, the entire tradition of the Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Sifra, Sifri, Tosefta, Mechilta, all the Midrashim, the Zohar, the Kabbalistic works. Major explosion of scholarship, of creativity, of the entire body of Jewish law and depth. It happens at the heels of an incredible tragedy. You have the Crusades in the 11th century, the first one, 1096, and in its very aftermath, you have the explosion of Ashkenazic scholarship, of Rashi and Tosfos, and his entire family and all of their students in France, Europe, England, Western Europe. At the heels of the Spanish expulsion on Tisha B'Av, 1492, you have this blossoming of the whole mystical tradition of Judaism, the Kabbalah, and Shabsi Tzvi converts to Islam in 1666. He was born on Tisha B'Av. That's why he could call himself the Mashiach, a false Mashiach. He converts to Islam in 1666. It's right after 1648-49, the Khmelnytsky pogroms massacred hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout Poland. It was one of the lowest moments in Jewish history. And literally, a few decades later, you have the development, the birth of a major movement that changed the landscape of Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov, the Hasidic movement, and in the Lithuanian world, the whole yeshiva movement. And now, just 2 mortgages ago, after the greatest calamity to befall us, the Holocaust, and I'm just coming home now from a lecture. I was sitting at a lecture we had in our shul of a Holocaust survivor. And he was telling, all the children the stories and showing them the number. And today's rear, unfortunately,
do not necessarily reflect those of AM 620 WSNR or its management.
This is AM 620 WSNR, Jersey.
Go ahead, Rabbi Y. Jacobson.
Sorry. So after such destruction, I mean, look what happens. Jewish people, men, women, and children, they rebuild the Jewish people, they rebuild the Jewish world, first of all, in Israel, of course. Today that we have close to 7 million Jews living in Israel. Let's not underestimate the miracle. And throughout the whole world, an unprecedented, vibrant rejuvenation as in JEW, of Jewish life, of Jewish spirit, of Jewish communities, of Jewish education. How does all of this happen? It happens because the Jewish people have in their DNA this conviction that somehow we don't just try to live through a crisis and go back. Rather, from every crisis we know we have to emerge deeper, wiser, stronger, more blessed, more creative, and more empowered.
And you're absolutely correct. And because after considering, in fact, there are probably more Jews killed in the Holocaust than in the destruction of the Second Temple. And certainly,
Indeed.
and you saw that right away, right after the Holocaust, you had the creation state of Israel, where today you have so many Jews, and you also have the biggest amount of Torah learning is taking place in Israel today. So you have that.
Indeed. According to Josephus, it seems like during the destruction of the Second Temple, could be there were 1 million Jews murdered, some say 2 million Jews, which, of course, is astronomical numbers. And until the Holocaust, that eclipsed every other tragedy because of the sheer quantity and quality. But the Holocaust, of course, was unprecedented. It remains the greatest black hole in the history of humanity and in the history of the Jewish people. And there's a Holocaust survivor. He should be well and healthy. His name is Rabbi Ben Sion Fishoff, a Ger Chosed, a survivor. And he once told me, he said, Rabbi Jacobson, he says, I want to tell you the miracle of my generation. And he said this, he says, the Talmud says in Tractate Sanhedrin, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were those three assistants of the Babylonian Emperor Nebuchadnezzar. They were talented, brilliant, handsome, wise young Jews that he took with him to Babylonia, and they became extremely instrumental in the Babylonian culture and the monarchy and the palace. And of course, they didn't want to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar as a god. And in the famous story, he throws them into the fiery furnace, and they survive. In the book of Daniel, the Talmud says, after that story, we never hear about them. It's like almost they disappear from the history of the Jewish people. We never hear about what happened to these three great people who just survived, the impossible conditions. And there's different opinions. One opinion, Rabbi Yochanan says in Tractate Sanhedrin, the 11th chapter, he says, I want to tell you what happened. Alul Eretz Yisrael, they made Aliyah, they went back to the land of Israel. Nasu Nashim, they got married, V'holidu banim u'banot, and they gave birth to sons and to daughters. And he looked at me, he said, and that's the greatest story. After coming out of a furnace, of a living fire, they reestablished a normal life. They went back to their land, they got married, and they built families. And then he looked at me and he said, the greatest miracle about our generation is at least so many of us tried to create normal lives. We got married, we built families, we went back there to Israel, we rebuilt Eretz Yisrael. And it's true, we have to look at our parents and our grandparents, and I know about the trauma of the survivors and their children and their grandchildren, epigenetics. No simple thing at all, and there's consequences. Hitler's hand, sadly, is very long. But look at the miracle that most of them should believe in life and in love and in family and in success. It's incredible. And as I was speaking once at a Sheva Brachas with survivors quite a few years ago, there were Auschwitz survivors there, and I said, it's not even like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were plucked out of that furnace unscathed. But the survivors today, they have survived, but most of their families remained in the gas chambers, were burnt in the crematoriums. They were not saved. These were a few people, Ud Mutzel Meyesh, small pockets of Jewish survivors. And yet they had the courage and the tenacious faith and conviction and resilience to say, we will emerge as the most powerful, empowered, loving nation, committed to life, love, morality, kindness, Yiddishkeit. And we have to be grateful because these are timeless, eternal heroes.
It was so well said, because they had a choice. Even getting revenge, the biggest revenge is not going after the Nazis and the criminals, but by having children. And that really is putting Hitler to death. And by the way, as we break, there's something that stands out in my mind, is that when Hitler died in the bunker, and they found the artifacts that were there. I don't know if you were aware of that. Among the artifacts they found was a Gemara Pesachim, the tractate of Pesachim, which deals with with the Jewish people. And he was killed April 20th, which is around Pesach time.
Right.
So he wanted to bury the Jewish people, and the Gemara, what ended up burying him was the Gemara Pesachim, which deals with Pesach and the liberation of the Jewish people. I just find that the irony is there, and today the biggest revenge on Hitler is having so many more Jews repopulating, giving birth, staying committed to Judaism. That, I think, is the antidote and the answer out of the Holocaust, out of the ashes of destruction, which we also learned in the first and second temples, is that dedicated Jewish spirit and the Jewish life. That's the answer.
Indeed.
Rabbi,
I heard once. Yeah. Are we breaking?
No, go ahead, and then we'll break.
I once heard from Professor Eliezer Wiesel, Eli Wiesel, Zechariah Levracha, who was, of course, in Auschwitz and in Buchenwald, and the Nobel Prize laureate for peace, and one of the very well-known Holocaust survivors and writers about the Holocaust. And he was a close friend of my father, who you interviewed many times on this show, the late Gershon Jacobson, the editor of the Allgemeine Journal. They were very close friends because they were both journalists. They worked together for many, many years in journalism. And I heard this from my father, I heard this from Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel refused to get married after the war because he felt, and one can really understand him, that it would be so unfair and unjust to raise a family in a world, to put it in his words, to raise children in a world that was deaf to the cry of 1.5 million children sent to gas chambers. How can I trust such a world and bring in a new generation of Jewish children? I do not want to subject them to such a horrific fate, which can't even be described by the human pen. And he felt that he would be much better off living as a journalist, as a thinker, as an essayist, as a novelist, as a writer, and dying a lone man. And he credited another fascinating personality, the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, who spent hours, I heard this from Wiesel, he said, we spent hours, late nights in the 1960s, and the Rebbe said to me, he said, Professor Wiesel, all of your books, all of your lectures are amazing and incredible and important, but the real memory and revenge against Hitler, as you say, is, he said, if you'll find a Jewish woman and you'll get married and you'll bring a new generation to this world, he said, that will be the ultimate victory of goodness against evil. And indeed, he obeyed this suggestion of the Rebbe. He married his wife, may she be well. And I heard from him that at the wedding, people sent telegrams and different bouquets. He said the most beautiful bouquet of flowers was sent to him by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And a year later, he had his son Elisha, who was born around the same time I was born. And Elie Wiesel said, I came to your bris, and your parents came to my son's bris. And he named his son for his father, who perished in Auschwitz, Elisha.
Who we just had on there just the other day, who did a rally for Israel in Washington, D.C. because of a neder, or a vow that he made.
Right. So we shouldn't take for granted, that these people got married and they created a future, even though it was so difficult. Because, today everybody speaks about trauma. Who can even imagine the trauma of a 16-year-old, of a 15-year-old, who watched their mothers, fathers, brothers, baby sisters, grandparents, uncles and aunts go up in the smoke of the crematorium? I mean, who can even imagine this type of trauma? And the fact that they emerged from it, not unscathed, they all suffered. They all suffered terribly. Some of them, the screaming during the nights, and some of them by not having the ability to express emotions, and by some of them becoming very rough and tough. Not unscathed, but nonetheless so committed to the eternity of their people and to the legacy of their parents who were decimated. I mean, tonight is a night to salute all of these people and express our gratefulness and gratitude for the greatest gift that they have given us, the gift of life and the gift of resilience. Today, in psychology, they speak about epigenetics, that we carry our traumas in our genes and we pass them on to our children. And, and psychotherapists and doctors are explaining today that a lot of the trauma that our youth is facing is not their own. It may be from epigenetics. It may be from their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-grandparents. 2,000 years of trauma may be coming out now in the Jewish world. But I always tell my students, I say, listen, that's true. It's absolutely true. But let's remember, our genes did not only inherit the trauma. Our genes also carry the faith, the fortitude, the wisdom, the strength, the conviction of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. It's all there in our genes. Same people, same genes, same nation.
Our guest is Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, one of the top Jewish scholars in Torah, Jewish mysticism. He's a very sought-after speaker in the Jewish world today, dealing with topics of spirituality. He's the first rabbi ever to be invited by the Pentagon to deliver the religious keynote for the United States military chief of chaplains. He also founder and is a dean of the yeshiva.net. When we come back, we continue our conversation. We're looking Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. And if you have any questions, you have any thoughts about Tisha B'Av, here is somebody that you can get some good answers from.
Talkline radio and TV with Zev Brenner is just phenomenal. Everybody concerned about the Jewish community should listen and watch. He has the best guests. He asks the most interesting questions. He's always so well prepared. It's talk radio and television from a Jewish point of view at its very best.
To advertise on the Talkline network and Talkline's email and social media blasts reaching over 70,000 people, please call 212-769-1925.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Extension 100. That's 212-769-1925, extension 100. Or email info@talklinenetwork.com.
Are you interested in hosting your own radio show and podcast, or perhaps a TV program? Talkline Network can help you get on the air from 1 hour weekly to 24 hours a day. Ideal for ethnic, foreign language, medical, business, and religious broadcasting. We also have full-time radio stations for lease, as well as FM HD channels. For more information, please call 212-769-1925. That's 212-769-1925. Or email zevbrenner@gmail.com.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now your host.
Our special guest here on Tisha B'Av night is Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, a noted scholar, lecturer, specialist in Jewish mysticism. He was the first rabbi to be invited by the Pentagon to deliver the religious keynote to the United States military. He was involved with the Allgemeine Journal, which was started by his father, Gershom Jacobson, of blessed memory. Did I ever tell you, Rabbi Jacobson, that I was in Uzbekistan in the 1990s, and I was in Tashkent or Bukhari, I forgot where I was, and a man walks over to me and he goes, "Where are you from?" I go, "I'm from New York City." He goes, "Maybe you know my nephew." I said, "There's only 1.2 million Jews in the metropolitan New York area. Who is your nephew?" He goes, "Do you know Gershom Jacobson, the editor of the Allgemeine Journal?" And I said, "Of course I did." I took a picture and I gave it to your father. So so you have relatives that were in Uzbekistan in the 1990s. I don't know if they're still there.
Yeah.
But we're looking at
my father's family came from Georgia, South Russia, and my mother was also born there. So we're connected to that part of the world, that zip code.
Right. There were more Jews there, but they left. We were talking about resiliency and the and the Holocaust. I'm struck by a story that you may have heard, but I just find the story so fascinating because lots of Jews that went through the Holocaust, some of them turned more religious, some unfortunately turned less religious because of their experiences. And the story is told about the Dean of American Orthodoxy, Rabbi Silver. And he was
the rabbi of Cincinnati.
Eliezer Silver, who was there. And he wanted to have a minyan for Mincha. I forgot which DP camp he was in. So he says to a man, will you join us for Mincha? And the man says, absolutely not. And he goes, why? He goes, well, I was in the concentration camp, and there was a man who was smuggling a siddur, and he was charging people a piece of bread to daven from the siddur. I don't want any part of such religion. So Rabbi Silver said, why are you looking at the man who sold his siddur for a piece of bread? Why not look at the people willing to give up a piece of bread to use the siddur? And the man said, you're right, he went to daven mincha. That was Simon Wiesenthal.
Yes, incredible story. It's an incredible story. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Simon Wiesenthal, one of the last years of his life, there's an organization of European rabbis, a group of European rabbis, and they honored Simon Wiesenthal. And they gave him a prayer book. And at the dinner, he shared this amazing story, which I think happened in Bergen-Belsen.
Okay, it's amazing, but it shows also everything is perspective. You can look at Tisha B'Av as being a day of just despair and terrible calamities. You can also look at Tisha B'Av as a day where there's tremendous potential. In fact, Rabbi Daniel Melman, he said that the word shachar is black. You just give a little kvesh, you change it a little bit. That word shachar turns into shachar, which is morning.
Shachar.
So
which is morning, dawnbreak. Alot
exactly.
Shachar.
So
right.
It's all
and the mystics say that right before dawnbreak is the darkest moment, so the two become one. The shachar comes from the shachar.
Now we've been focused,
and I would say psychologically too. They say there's a famous expression: the way out of pain is through pain. The way out of tears is through tears. Meaning, when we suppress our pain or we repress our pain and we can't look at it, we can't deal with it, it remains in our body and it's stuck there. And it leaks out in all types of dysfunctional ways. The famous title of a book, when you bury your emotions live, they don't die. And as they say today, the body really keeps the score. So I think it's one of the brilliant ideas of Tisha B'Av that our sages and our prophets in the days of yore understood. Yes, life, we don't do Tisha B'Av every day of the year. We live, we love, we celebrate, we sing, we dance, we eat, we drink, and we continue building a godly and holy and moral world. But there's a full day that's just dedicated to be able to experience whatever is going on without judgment, the real grief of the day. And on this day, in the kinos, in the lamentations, in the poems that we read on Tisha B'Av, we go through so many different chapters of Jewish history, in addition to the destruction of both temples that happened on Tisha B'Av. So it's really, they dedicate, and they said, on this day, cry it out, feel it, experience it, respect it, have compassion for it, pay tribute to it. And then from that, take your energy and your resources and continue to build with your faith and with your conviction.
I'm developing this thought because they say that the one day a year when Satan, the evil forces, have no control over Jewish people, of course, is Yom Kippur. The flip side is Tisha B'Av, where he has complete control. Look what havoc that he's done, whether it's the destruction of the first and second temple, the Crusaders, the Holocaust, the destruction of Beit Tar, etc. So many calamities happen. And it takes place. Now, I believe it's the Medrash that says, or maybe it's the Zohar, you would know better, that says that there's a pasuk, there's a verse in the Torah that says that the Bnei Yisrael don't eat es gid hanash, they don't eat the sinew of the flesh of an animal, and the word aleph tav, sciatica, that the word es comes to teach us something. It stands for Av Tisha, the ninth day of Av. So therefore it corresponds to Tisha B'Av, and from what I've also seen, I believe in Medrash, is this is the night that Yaakov wrestled with the angel of Esav. and he won, even though the angel wounded him with the progeny, with his kids. But he still came out victorious, and that night was Tisha B'Av. So that's why God picked Tisha B'Av as a day of Jewish suffering, because built into the very day is the victory that Yaakov had over the angels. So therefore, that's why it was picked. So therefore, we can cull that strength from this day.
Right, and just to extend that beautiful thought is, in the morning, that mysterious angel and adversary tells Jacob, leave me alone, let me go free, it's morning, I gotta go. And Jacob says, Lo ashalecha chakim beirachtani, I will not let you go until you bless me, which is quite of a strange comment. Imagine a gangster attacks somebody and they're trying to kill you all night, and then they maim you and they dislocate your sciatic nerve. At the end of the night, you say, wait, before you go, I want a bracha, I want a blessing. That's not what you do. Either call the police, call 911, run away, punch him in the face. What's the statement that Jacob is making? But really, Jacob is bequeathing to the Jewish people for eternity maybe one of our most powerful statements, and that is, when I encounter adversity in my life, when I encounter trauma, individual trauma, collective trauma, it's not just enough for me to say, let me leave this painful moment. Jacob says, no, take it one step further. Say, I will not let you go until you bless me. When the Jewish people faced crisis throughout their history, they didn't just say, let's get over this and move on. They all emulated and paraphrased those words and that declaration of Jacob. Lo ashalecha chakim berechtani. We will not let go of this crisis, of this challenge, until we do not emerge from it more blessed, more perceptive, more wise, more invigorated, believing that within every challenge lay the seeds for a new beginning that is unprecedented and incredible. And that's why they compared redemption to birth and exile to the pangs before birth. The birth pangs of the woman are very painful, and I'm not going to be a man now talking about things I don't know about from experience, but we all understand that giving birth is one of the most excruciatingly difficult things, and we're always grateful to our wives and our mothers for their incredible self-sacrifice. But in that pain, there's always the potential and the heralding of an incredibly new beginning. And that combination is such a blessed combination, to be able to grieve, to be able to sob, to be able to feel the pain, and yet to know deep down that it's not here to break us. It's here to open us up to a new blessing, to a new opportunity, even if we can't always understand how and why.
Wonderful, wonderful thought.
There's, as you were talking, I was thinking the Talmud says at the end of Tractate Tainus that the spies came back from their tour of the land of Israel. They came back on Tisha B'Av, and they dissuaded the people from entering into the land, and everybody was weeping all night because they were overtaken by national hysteria, that they would go into the land and be decimated. And the Talmud says, God said, you're crying tonight in vain. There's really no reason for you to cry. But one day, this is going to be a night in which you're going to cry earnestly because of the destruction. And somebody once asked me, what was this, an ego game? God says, you're crying and you're not supposed to cry. I'm going to give you such a smack that you're going to cry for real. Like, okay, so they're crying in vain. And I think one of the powerful points is that it's actually a result. In other words, when we're overtaken by that fear, by that sense of paralysis, and we're crying for a reason that we shouldn't be crying because we have the resources to do it, the result of that is that we ultimately become paralyzed in moments when we don't have to be paralyzed. And we really experience difficulties that we could overcome with the right attitude and conviction. I don't know if he's the man to quote on Tisha B'Av, Henry Ford, but he did say, whether you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're right. If I believe I can, I'm right. And if I believe I can't, I'm also right. Because my belief about what my capabilities are will determine my capabilities. So when the Jewish people are overtaken by a sense of hopelessness and despair, God forbid it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's why the focus of all the leaders throughout all generations was understand the pain. And if you need to cry, cry, but don't allow those tears to become tears of helplessness. Allow those tears to become tears that motivate you to find your inner creativity and potential that you may have not known about.
You know, when you were speaking, you remind me of a story about the tzaddik of Jerusalem, Rabbi Aryeh Levine, who I recommend the book, A Tzaddik in Our Times. If you want to be inspired,
yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful book. But there's a story in there. A woman says that, she cried and cried and cried for her husband. I guess he passed away. And what happened to all these tears? Because, her husband unfortunately passed away. So Rabbi Levine very nicely, and he said to her that God took her tears and then he saves those tears and he uses them for another occasion. And so her tears don't go to waste. No tears go to waste. So when you cry from the base of Midrash, even if we don't see the temple rebuilt in our times, those tears don't go to waste. They're collected and used by God. I thought that was such a beautiful thought from Rabbi Aryeh Levine.
Indeed. You mentioned Rabbi Aryeh Levine. I was just at a Shabbaton with 600 or 700 couples, parents whose children are struggling. That's the common denominator of that Shabbaton. It was in the Catskills. And it was a very emotional Shabbos. I mean, these are parents from the entire spectrum of what you would call the Orthodox Jewish world. Literally the entire spectrum. And their children are struggling in different ways, different levels, different ways. And they came together to strengthen each other. An organization called Kesher Nafshi. So I spoke Shabbos lunch. And I told them something about Rabbi Aryeh Levine, and I think it's appropriate to share on Tisha B'Av. He had a student who learned by him, and the student left Judaism. He left the path of Yiddishkeit, of Jewish observance. And one day, Rabbi Aryeh was walking in Jerusalem. Rabbi Aryeh died in 1969, so this was in the 50s or in the 60s. He's walking in Jerusalem, and he sees from a distance the student of his, who was a tall fellow. Rabbi Aryeh Levine was a short fellow. He was a tall fellow. And the man notices that Rabbi Aryeh Levine is approaching him, and he's without a kippah, he's without a yarmulke. He looks like a classical, typical Jew, Israeli secular Jew. And he doesn't want to make his teacher or himself feel awkward or uncomfortable. So he crosses the street. So he shouldn't have to meet him. And Rabbi Aryeh Levine notices him, and he decides he wants to see him. And he pursues him, and he walks after him until he catches up to him. And his student is forced to stop. And Rabbi Aryeh Levine says, "Why are you running away from me? What do you think, I'm going to bite you?" And he says, "Rebbe, I'll be honest with you." And he says in Hebrew, "I'll be very honest with you. I'm not wearing a kippah. I'm not wearing a yarmulke. I'm not observant. And I didn't want to embarrass you. I didn't want to humiliate you. I didn't want to feel uncomfortable myself in front of you. And so I just crossed the street." And his old Rebbe looked at him and he says, "Listen, my dear friend, listen, my dear student, I'm a short man." Rabbi Aryeh Levine was a short man. "I'm a short man. I don't see above your heart."
Very nice.
So I said it's so important. It's so important. We often judge people by external garments, which are important. They're important, but we often reduce the entire person to how they look, how they don't look, if they fit in, if they don't fit in. And we often sacrifice the most important element, and that is to really tune in and become connected to the soul of the person, to the heart of the person. Judaism pays tribute and finds external elements important. But when the externals become more important than what we call the pnimis, the inner foundation, the inner core, then we're in trouble.
You mentioned Rabbi Levine, just for our audience doesn't know, he was a Jerusalemite rabbi who went to the prisons every Shabbos to tend to the prisoners, especially those from the Irgun and the Lehi who were incarcerated, British prisoners, for their service to Israel. And while he came from a very religious background, and most of the others were from non-religious backgrounds for the most part, but they loved him, so he loved them, didn't ask questions, they loved him. and he was able to communicate where he kept in touch with them. And there's such incredible stories of his devotion and their devotion to him, which I'm just going to share one short one, because on Tisha B'Av we're dealing with sinas chinam, how people hate each other for no apparent reason. And the story is told, you probably know this, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, is that he was learning the Torah in the prison, which he did every Shabbos, and I think one of the Arab guards came from the prison warden to say that the warden wants to see you, and he ignored it. And they came again. Finally, the warden himself came. Turns out that Rabbi Levine's daughter was sick, so he left, and the people figured that he was not going to show up the next week. The next Shabbos he shows up, and again he lay, even though his daughter was very, very sick. So they give the first aliyah, and when the prisoner gets up and he says, "I donate 1 hour for the life of my Rebbe," and the other person gave 1 day and 1 week and they were willing to dedicate that for their Rebbe. And that Saturday night, that his daughter recuperated, was on the road to recovery, but shows the love they had for him and he had for them, and that kind of love which we need more of, because there's a divide, as you know very well, between religious and non-religious, but there really shouldn't be a divide. If we did our job properly, there would be more people that we'd be able to communicate with, and not just close the door and say we're just going to tend to ourselves. We have an obligation to help other people and to be Makarev and to be there, a beacon of light, and to show the love that Judaism really has. You have a lot of places, you have people, for example, we've covered the new TV show on Netflix, My Unorthodox Life. You have people leaving and bashing the religion, and we have to really do something more to show the beauty of what we're all about.
Indeed. And I think, the more one is secure in their own skin, comfortable in their own identity, and anchored in an unshakable confidence and commitment, they don't have to be deterred and overwhelmed and dismiss people who are different, who are struggling, who have different opinions. I can create space for other people. You don't shake me up because if you have a different opinion. I don't have to be judgmental and dismissive. I think judgmentalism and dismissiveness is very toxic. It doesn't help anybody, and it comes from a place of holier than thou, and it really comes from an inferiority complex. So I think people who are really confident in their own skin can really embrace people, and instead of distancing them, they could listen to them. They can show them respect. We can disagree without becoming disagreeable. And the dangers among our people is not when we disagree. It's fine to disagree. It's when we stop trusting each other. It's when we can't support each other. We can't lean on each other. We always have to be able to be here for each other, even if we disagree with each other. Rabbi Soloveitchik once shared, there was a story that the Tosfos brings in Tractate Menachos. The Talmud speaks about a boy who was born with 2 heads, about Tefillin. So the Tosfos brings a story that there was a fellow who had 2 heads, and his father died, and he demanded a double portion of the inheritance because he has 2 heads, so he's like 2 people, right? His father left real estate on Fifth Avenue, so he wanted a double portion of the real estate. So they came to King Solomon, and King Solomon said, let's blindfold one of the heads and pour some hot shallant on the other head, and if the blindfolded head would scream, it means it's really one person, and if not, it would be 2 people, and you could give him a double portion of the inheritance. And Rabbi Soloveitchik said, what's the point of the strange advice of King Solomon? And homiletically, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik said that, the Jewish people don't have 1 head. We have many heads. We have multiple opinions and perspectives and Weltanschauungen and vantage points. 2 Jews, 19 opinions. Every Jew has a different opinion. And sometimes within the same Jew, you have different opinions. Depends on the hour, depends on the day, depends who you visit. He said, the problem is not that we have many heads. The problem is that if I pour hot scalding water on one head, the other head doesn't scream. As long as the other head cries out in pain, it means we have many heads, but we are one organism. We're one person. The moment that hot water is being poured on somebody's head, and I'm not sympathetic, I'm not part of it, he says that's the danger. That means it's not just 2 heads, it's 2 people. And I think it's so important today. We can have disagreements, and some of those disagreements are genuine. Not only that, I may look at somebody's behavior and I really feel that, they're making a serious mistake with serious consequences. But instead of becoming judgmental and dismissive and scornful and toxic and negative, can I really try to listen to the person? try to understand them so they can understand me. And even more importantly, tune into their soul and believe in their soul and always connect to that space in them, because that's ultimately what allows people to come back. It's what allows people to find their own dignity when others don't stop believing in them. So come from a place of confidence. And the more anchored you are in Torah, the more anchored you are in love and fear of God, and Yirat Shamayim, the more loving you should be, the more embracing you should be, because the more divine you are, the more you could see the divine in other people. When religion becomes about holier than thou, and I'm righteous and you're not righteous, and I'm going to paradise and you're going to burn in purgatory, then we really lost touch with the essence of Yiddishkeit.
No, very, very true. We have to do. Listen, the essence is that even if we had worshipped idolatry, did all kinds of terrible things in the first temple period or in the second temple period, if we at least loved one another, I think this is what the rabbis say, is that God would have treated us in the same way. But if we treated others badly, there was no reason for God to overlook, the sins that we did if we don't tolerate other people. So that's an important lesson of even what's in the of the hatred that we have, is that we have to really be more tolerant, and we have to have more love, Ahavas Yisrael. And just like the temple was destroyed because of Sinas Chinam, I think Rav Kook has said that we have to have much more love. That's going to bring the redemption.
Right, for sure. Now, I think that sometimes somebody told me the other day, when people talk too much about Ahavas Yisrael, it's basically because they don't like religious Jews. It was a funny comment, but I think it's so important to be able to understand that both elements are so important. In other words, there's people who speak about love to everybody and everything. Prince version of Ahavas Yisrael doesn't come tolerance that's not based on principles. We have very powerful principles, and we have timeless tradition. It says HaTorah Hazu Lo Tia Machlefet. It's one of our principles. We don't change the Torah based on a new fad, based on a new cultural development, or based on a new up-ed article in the New York Times or a story on CNN. The power of Torah is its eternity, its timelessness. Shabbos was relevant 3,000 years ago. It's relevant today. It's going to be relevant in 3,000 years as well. So Ahavas Yisrael doesn't come from a sense of insecurity. We don't really believe in anything. We tolerate everybody. No. Ahavas Yisrael comes from a much deeper idea. And that is that God's presence is everywhere and in every person. And every person has something to teach us. Every person is inspiring, because every person is a unique reflection of God's infinity. The visage of God is carved in every human being. And if I find a person uninspiring, it's because I am not tuning in to the deeper layers of reality. And when you can really respect people in that sense, when you can really take pride in each one of your children. Sometimes we have children who are not following the exact path we dreamt. Sometimes we have friends, we have nephews, we have nieces, we have grandchildren. And we allow our personal pain to eclipse the value of these people. The more you're rooted in a real relationship with God, the more you see the presence of God in each person. And you can really connect to them and take pride in them and love them and cherish them and embrace them and don't judge them, even if there are things you genuinely disagree with.
Our guest is Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, well-known scholar, lecturer, founder of Yeshiva.net. He's a specialist in Jewish mysticism. He is a sought-out speaker around the world. When we come back, we continue for a little while longer our Tisha B'Av conversation, dealing with things that are relevant to the saddest day on the Jewish calendar.
Hi, this is David Gabe, and you're listening to the Zev Brenner Show.
Like us on Facebook.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Our guest for a little while longer, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson. He is renowned throughout the world. He lectures throughout the globe, and he's founder of the Yeshiva.net. He specializes in Jewish mysticism, and he certainly has been, as I mentioned, he was invited to speak by the Pentagon, the first rabbi ever to do so, to their U.S. military chief of chaplains. We're getting a bunch of emails coming in. You can keep them coming, zevbrenner@gmail.com, zevbrenner@gmail.com. Rabbi Jacobson, here's what a listener writes. Please ask Rabbi Jacobson, didn't the Lubavitcher Rebbe say that we have already done enough Ahavas Chinam to have fixed up the sinas chinam? That's the hatred that caused the destruction. He said we need to have Ahavas Yisrael to be ready for Geula and live Mashiach Dika. Look at all the Ahavas Chinam going on today. Hatzalah, Chaverim, Chesed, Shalemus, etc., etc.
Listen, there's no question that in many ways there have been major, major improvements. Obviously, we can always find flaws and challenges, and there's always room for improvement, and each of us has to be introspective in our own life. And if there's somebody you're not on speaking terms with, this is a good time to reconsider, send them an email, send them a WhatsApp, give them a call. If you have a brother, a sister-in-law, a brother-in-law, a nephew, a niece, a father, a mother, an old partner, an old employer, employee, somebody in shul, we should all be on speaking terms with each other. So there's always room for improvement. There's no question that when you look at the Jewish people, despite our flaws and despite our mistakes and errors, there's incredible kindness and generosity and love. I mean, look at just what happened at Surfside. I mean, how many communities came together and how much money was raised. People are present here for each other. You mentioned Hatzalah, heroes, extraordinary heroes, and so many others in all communities in Israel and in America and everywhere else. So there's no question about that. And when you study Jewish history, we learn about some very, very ugly fights and a lot of suspicion and animosity. I think today, in many ways, there have been many improvements. And part of it is, we have matured. People have realized that there's different paths. People realize that there's different perspectives, and we don't have to become suspicious of each other and hate each other. And yet, the fact is that we are still in Galus, and I certainly agree with you that it's high time that the Geula should come. But each and every one of us, I think, in our own way, has to ask ourselves, is there something that I can do today to promote a deeper level of love and unity and connection in my own life, in my own family, in my own community, in my own environment?
Thank you for that good question. Samuel writes, Chazal, which is the rabbis, tell us that since we cried upon hearing the report of the Meraglim, the spies, Hashem gave us Bechiyas L'Dorah, that means we were crying for generations on this night. It would seem that the Chet, the sin by the Meraglim, was the source of all the future Chorbans. Elsewhere, Chazal tell us that the first Churban was caused by Shalosh Averis, which means 3 Averis, and the second Churban by Sinas Chinam, by hating one another. How are these reflected in the Bechiyas Shel Chinam?
It's a great question. So what this person is asking is that there seems to be a contradiction here, and I think perhaps one of the answers to your question perhaps is that what happened that night when the spies came back with their horrible report about the incompetence of the Jewish people and our inability to enter our land, and we will fail and we will all be slain and die. What really overtook the Jewish people was a sense of paralysis, a sense of hopelessness. I mentioned before, today there's a lot of discussion about trauma. One of the devastating results of trauma is I go into a place of hopelessness, repeated patterns of thought. I'm stuck in the same neural pathways. I believe that there's nothing I can do. And that was the great catastrophe when the question that the Jewish people had to ask at that time was not whether we can go into the land. It's how we're going to do it, not if we're going to do it. The question became if instead of how. And they wept and wept because they felt literally stuck between a rock and a hard ball with nowhere to turn. And when we are stuck in that place, there's no room for transformation, for renewal. So in later generations, there was also major crises, whether it was idolatry, adultery, murder, hatred, because part of living is facing brokenness, facing crisis. We live in a world that is compartmentalized, that is misaligned. We live in a world where one does not see the divine presence in a manifested way. But as long as we have a fire burning in our belly, I could make a difference. I can make a difference for my life. I can make a difference for my loved ones. I can make a difference in the world. Then within every situation, we can find the calling. What is my calling? What is my mission? But when there is that innate sense of despondency and hopelessness, and all I can do is groan and moan and sigh about how bad things are, then we become stuck. I always tell my students, remember, there's only two choices in life. Either you're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. There's no other choice. There's no third choice. In every situation in Jewish life today, people complain about so many things. So I tell them, you're right. You're right. Maybe you're 100% right. But here's the question you have to answer. I have to answer. We have to answer. Am I going to be part of the problem or am I going to be part of the solution? When the answer is I'm going to be part of the solution, everything changes because now I'm not a victim anymore. Now the question is, what am I going to be doing tonight? What am I going to be doing tomorrow morning to be part of the solution, not part of the problem?
And it's a very, very good question. Thank you, Sam, for really a good one. Here's the thing that I just wanted to focus on for a little bit. We've been focusing and looking at the destruction of the first temple, the second temple, but the real truth is that the real calamity, and yes, as devastating this destruction of the second temple was, but the real loss, the real damage came after 67 years later, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, where you had the sages killed, where the Romans were just killing indiscriminately, where they shipped people to Rome. That's when the real destruction was, the Bar Kokhba revolt. And Rabbi Akiva thought Rabbi Kokhba was the Messiah. He certainly held off the forces of Rome for about 5 years, and he minted his own coins, and he was in control. Amazing. You had, as you said, Rabbi Jacobson, that 1 million or 2 million Jews died at the destruction of the temple, was destroyed, and yet within 60 years or 70 years, you had Bar Kokhba was able to rout the Roman army. They had to send troops from Britain to quell the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took 5 years to do so. An amazing thing. But that really was the end of Jewish life in Israel, was that period of time when the destruction of Beitar.
Indeed. The temple was destroyed in the year 70 after the Common Era. Some say 68, 69, but either 68, 69, or 70. The Bar Kokhba revolt broke out approximately 60 years later, in the year 130 or 132 after the Common Era, until it was crushed around 135 or 136 after the Common Era through Adrian. And it was brutal and merciless. Bar Kokhba himself was murdered, and approximately, it's estimated, more than 500,000 Jews were murdered. And that really was the end, because then they saw that Bar Kokhba was not Mashiach. The third temple would not be rebuilt now. And it was one of the darkest, no question, one of the darkest periods of Jewish history. In fact, people don't realize that every day, every single day, we remember the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that is the fourth blessing in the grace after meals. There used to be 3 blessings, and it was after the Bar Kokhba revolt that was crushed that the sages added the blessing, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Hatov, what they called Hatov, v'Hametiv, who Hativ lanu, the last blessing of benching grace after meals. Why? As the Talmud says, because it took years for the Roman emperor to give permission for the Jews to bury the hundreds of thousands slain in Beitar. Their bodies, their corpses lay strewn in blood without permission to bury them. It was only years later that they could bury them, and they found 2 things. Number one, they were thankful that they could bury them, and that the bodies were there, that they could bury them. There were corpses there. And they made a blessing for this, which is interesting. Like, what are you making a blessing for such a catastrophe? Like Hatov, Hametiv, that we could bury them, that their bodies did not compose. Okay, it's nice that you could bury them, but, thanks, but no thanks. I would rather have them alive. And I think it represented something fabulous for the Jewish people. And that is God was giving them what you would call a wink from heaven. He said, listen, I know this is not redemption. And I know that there's a long, dark road ahead of you. But don't think that you're not my people. And don't think you were abandoned. And don't think that you were neglected. And don't think that there is some mysterious meaning and plan in your history. Don't think that that covenant we made together at Sinai to change the world has been obliterated. You know where else there was a wink from heaven? The Torah says in Genesis that when Joseph was sold as a slave in the caravan that took him as a slave to Egypt, there were wonderful, fragrant spices. So the Medrash says God wanted Joseph to have an enjoyable ride to Egypt. And when I read this the first time, I'm like, thanks, but no thanks. You know, you kidnapped me, you're selling me into slavery, but you're giving me a first-class ticket on the airplane. Thank you. Why don't you just send me back home? The idea, of course, was there was a very subtle message here. You're not being sold. You're being sent. I'm with you. This is a wink from heaven. You're not alone. I know it's a challenge, but Joseph at that moment knew he was not a victim. He was a shliach. He was sent. That's what he tells his brothers 22 years later. You know why I forgave you? Because you did not sell me. God sent me. The moment you can see your life's journey as a mission rather than a story of victimhood, it's a game changer. And at Beitar, the Jewish people got that wink. So despite the grief and despite the sobs, they made a blessing, and they want us to say it every day in benching. Whenever you wash for bread, you're talking about Bar Kochva and Beitar. Why is that such an important moment in Jewish history? Because it showed them that even after it was over, to quote Yogi Berra, it's not over till it's over. And the Jewish people always knew that it's not over.
Wonderful thought. By the way, as an aside, now the difference of opinion, and maybe it's a minority one, but based on the verses in the Torah, it seems to me clear that the brothers didn't sell Joseph, didn't sell Yosef. It was
right,
actually
the Rashbam.
The Rashbam and the Cheskuni and others have said that. And you look at the Psukim itself, because
yes, no question.
And it makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing that when you read the Psukim without any preconceived notions, it's that the Midianites, they're the ones who pulled them out of the pit and they sell them into slavery, which, by the way, answers some very dramatic questions.
Makes it a lot easier.
Makes it a lot easier because the brothers, when they come back to the pit, he's not there. And they don't know he's sold into slavery, which means they really believe that he's dead. And that's why even when they see the grief of their father, they don't go to buy him back. Why don't they just go back to Egypt? What happens? They really think the boy is dead. They threw him into a pit and he's gone. They are certain that a cheetah, a tiger, a hyena, or a lioness killed Joseph and schlepped him away. There's no question in their mind. They don't have a clue that he's actually alive. And that's why, I always wondered as a kid learning, if I was one of those tribes and I'm speaking to the prime minister of Egypt and he knows everything about my family and I know that I sold him to Egypt, like, why didn't they suspect that, he had a beard, they didn't recognize him, fine, but why did nobody say, hey, maybe he's the man? But they really thought he was dead, and that's why when they realized that it's Joseph, they were shocked. So the story actually has a lot of merit based on that view of the Rashbam, that they never sold them into slavery. Of course, Rashi has a different interpretation.
Well, Rashi has to gyrate and say that it was Reuven's turn to go serve his father. Right. So he leaves him. He wants to save him, and he leaves him to go, miles and miles away, which I never understood. Because it doesn't flow easily into the narrative. But if you say that he was sold by others and the brothers didn't know that he was sold, everything fits in, as you said, just fits him beautifully. And that's why, like you said, when they came face to face with him, even though they said, they didn't recognize his brother, he had a beard, he spoke Egyptian. And I say to myself, if I haven't seen a brother in 20-some years, and he had a beard and he spoke French, I wouldn't recognize him. right? I just find it hard, right? But if you take this approach, everything just flows so much
Right.
smoother.
It's a fascinating approach. It was suggested by the Rashbam, who was Rashi's grandson, and Reb Shmuel ben Meir. He was Rashi's grandson. He learned at the feet of his grandfather, and he writes that he once heard from his grandfather Rashi that if he would have had time, he could write many new commentaries on Chumash, because every day there are new levels of interpretation. So that's why he argues very often with his grandfather.
Yeah,
There's even there's even an interesting interpretation. This is already suggested by a sefer. It was in New York in the 1920s, who said that Joseph suspected. The question is, why didn't Joseph send a telegram or a letter or a messenger
or a fax
to
or
his
an
father?
Instagram, right?
Yeah, 22 years. Okay, maybe when he was in prison he could not, but you're the prime minister. You could send a messenger to your father and say, Tati, I'm alive. It's a very, very difficult question. So one very interesting answer, certainly many people disagree, is that Joseph may have suspected, some say Joseph suspected that his father was behind it, that deep down his father may have arranged it, and therefore he could not go back to his father because he felt that Jacob wanted this to happen. And only when Judah told him how his father has been grieving for 22 years, and if he loses Benjamin, he will go down straight into the grave, Joseph realized that he made an error and that Jacob really was completely innocent. It's certainly an interesting perspective, even though, of course, many disagree with it because
Rabbi
of
Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun has been saying that
Yeah.
contemporary. But the truth is, the question that I believe he raised was when Joseph was being sold by the Midianites, the Ishmaelim, and the Torah is very confusing who sold them. I think it's done
Very,
purposely.
very. Rashi says he was sold many times. What I have shared, and I think there may be some merit to this, is that Joseph couldn't send a message to his father, and there's a very profound idea here. Of course, he could have told Jacob, "Hey, Tati, I'm alive," and Jacob would say, "Wow, let's throw a party," and the family would meet, and they would throw a big feast, and everybody would smile. They would take pictures. It would be all over WhatsApp. But Joseph would know that the infection was not healed. Our family is a fractured family. We're a broken family. I was sold into slavery by my brothers. We may unite for the pictures, and everybody will talk about it. It'll be a front-page story in the newspapers. Zev Brenner will interview us on the Mitzvah Shabbos program. It'll be great. But deep down, when we look back to our homes, the infection is still there. Because Joseph understood there's something broken in our family. And it's only after taking the brothers through the ringer and really having them reassess their lives and their priorities, that Joseph at some point feels we have matured. And only then can they become a people. So I think that's really what he was thinking about. He was a visionary. He was an extraordinary man. And he realized that you can't compromise and create short-term solutions that in the long term will only prove to be detrimental, because the same thing will happen again. And I think it's true throughout our history. Sometimes we create Band-Aids. Oh, there's a problem here? We'll put a Band-Aid, another Band-Aid, another Band-Aid. No. Look at Surfside. I mean, it's very difficult to say this. Look at Miram, look at Surfside, look at Carlin. You can have the most beautiful structure in the world, right near the beach. But if the foundations are weak, don't get so mesmerized by the outer beauty, by the fact that it's one of the most expensive condos in Florida. It's beautiful, it's stunning, the maintenance is incredible. But if the foundations are not powerful, we all have to be afraid. And I think it's true. It's such a tragic. Sometimes we put in so much effort in cosmetics. We want everything to look good. Our communities to look good. Our schools to look good. Our families to look good. The wedding to look good. The shidduch to look good. The kids should look good. Everybody should be dressed to the tea. And we sometimes ignore crumbling foundations. Joseph understood that. If you are not going to heal those foundations, if we don't have the courage to ignore cosmetics a little bit and get to a core level of healing, we're in trouble.
And I hear what you're saying, and it sounds right. But the only thing that I would like to maybe respectfully disagree, is it didn't really help very much, because at the end of the day, the brothers and Yosef didn't really get along so great. After the Yaakov died, Jacob died, there was tension there, as in the conversation. So they were always suspicious. One that was never really a great family-loving relationship between Joseph and his brother. In fact, one of the commentators says...
You're not disagreeing. You have a good point, because we know that the conflict continued in later generations. The first split of the Commonwealth after Solomon died, he was succeeded by his son Rechavam, and the kingdom split. There were two kings. Yerovam came from the tribe of Ephraim, who was a son of Joseph, and Rechavam was the successor of Solomon, who was, of course, from the tribe of Yehuda. And there became a split in the Jewish people, what led to the destruction of the first temple, because the nation was weak. The nation was split into two. You had the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, and ultimately the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom were exiled by the Assyrians, and they ultimately assimilated, and they have been lost to the Jewish people since then. And there were only 2 tribes left. So that split between Joseph and Judah resurfaces later in Jewish history, and that's why the Talmud speaks about 2 messiahs, Mashiach ben Yosef, the Mashiach, the son of Yosef, Mashiach ben David. So you're 100% right that the reconciliation at the time was not complete. In fact, there's a Sfas Emes. Sfas Emes was the second Ger Rebbe. He died in 1905, and he says that the Torah says, "V'layachli Yosef lihisapek." Joseph couldn't contain himself. He couldn't hold back, and he sent everybody out, and he said, "I'm Joseph." And the Sfas Emes says that it's almost like the Torah is lamenting. He couldn't contain himself anymore. He couldn't hold back his emotions. We wish he did, because the tikkun was not complete yet. We wish he did. That's what he says. He says the Torah is almost like sighing. It's like in Yiddish they say akrechts. The Torah get akrechts. The Torah is sighing. Like, Yosef, why didn't you hold yourself in a little longer until everything would be ripe for complete reconciliation? So there's different levels of reconciliation, 100%. And I guess there's, some of the last fragments of that reconciliation. It's our job to complete. I think most of it has been complete, but there's probably still a few little chips that we got to restore.
Let's take some phone calls. 212-769-1925. Yaakov in Midwood, your question for Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson.
Yes, the Chvod Harav. I'm looking at the book right now as to who sold him, who sold Yosef, but I want to talk to you about non-recognition first. He was, according to the Medrash, was wearing a visor, crown. He did not speak to them. He whispered to his son, who was the interpreter, and his son then spoke to them, then spoke back to his father in Egyptian, and that's why they didn't recognize his voice. They didn't recognize his face. His face was in a visor, and so there's common sense as to why he was. So you wouldn't have recognized your brother either, because he didn't speak directly to them. Number 2, after the Yehuda told him, our father will go down alive into the, Sheol, and then when he revealed him to you, he said, I am Joseph, your brother. Tell me, is our father alive? He was told that his father is alive, so why is he there? If he thought his father was behind it, he was talking about the Agmas Nefesh that his father went. He means to tell me, you're worried about Binyamin, and you're asking me, what about your father? What Agmas Nefesh did you give him for these 22 years? And you're telling me you're worried that he's going to go down in the Sheol? But when you see, you didn't worry about it. And in the pasuk it says, right here, Vayoma Yehuda al Achiv, Ma bet kinaro gezachinu b'chisinu esmo l'chu v'nem kavenu lishmeelim yodenu al tihibo ki achinu b'sarenuhu vayish echav. Then it says they lifted him up out of the bar and they took off his kesonet and they dipped it in blood. So they did it. They're as guilty as sin.
Right. Yeah. So these are all good comments and good questions, which is why there are different interpretations and different perspectives. Yes. Thank you.
The way I see it, it's clear that they were guilty. And what did they do to their dad? Over for 22 years. Who would do that to a father?
Right,
today?
but I'm saying the Rashbam is the one who says that they did not sell him. Just realize that it's not.
And the Fitzcooney and some others. And by the way, forgive me, but I personally believe, if you look at the psukim, that the Rashbam makes the most sense, because if you look at the actual words, it says, first of all, they went off to eat, and it says that the caravan of Midianites, it wasn't even Yishmaelim, they contemplated selling him to the Yishmaelim. And the Torah says that a caravan of Midianites came, and they drew Yosef, and they sold him to the Yishmaelim. They pulled him. Yeah. So
she has a very good essay, Nechama Leibowitz.
What about Vayishmael
a very good essay.
Listen to him. Vayishmael Echav. They paid it to what Yehuda. What about taking off his?
No.
That part doesn't say that.
No, you're mixing up two things.
Yeah.
They clearly come into the pit. The question is, who took him out of the pit and brought him to Egypt? Did the tribes take him out of the pit and sold him as a slave? Or was the Midianites who heard a boy crying, and they're the ones who drew him out of the pit? That's the question. So Rashi says it was the tribes. The Rashbam argues. That's in terms of your other comment, by the way. I wasn't referring to his conversations with them. I was referring to the fact that when they came the second time with Benjamin, it says that Joseph placed them each according to their ages. Vayismahu, they were astounded. They were astonished. So I always wondered why nobody had a hunch that maybe he knew if somebody knew my family's secrets, I would ask myself, maybe it's my lost brother. That's according to the Rashbam, it makes sense because they really thought he was dead. And it was certainly different perspectives, and it's certainly a fascinating and extraordinary conversation.
But thank you, Yaakov, for really raising some interesting questions. Obviously, there's Shivan Panim LaTorah, the 70 facets, and they're probably all right. So
they're all right, yeah. But he did wear. It does say in the Medrash that his face was covered. He was wearing a visor. So,
right.
But that's a matter. I'm not sure. And the point is, the Torah says Yehuda whispered into his ear, so they're close to him. And you can tell. Yes, if you're wearing a mask like during COVID, maybe it's hard to tell. But generally speaking, if you're looking somebody in the face and you're having conversation with them, you would be able.
To them, he talked to his son. He whispered to his son, and his son. But how did this?
That's there is of opinion. If he whispered to the interpreter, if he whispered in here, because even though he didn't speak the language, but he figured he felt that according to the Medrash, according to the comment, he thought that the interpreters were saying things wrong, so therefore he wanted to speak directly to Yosef, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he whispered directly into his ear in Parshas Vayigash. But you raised some very good questions, and I appreciate you sharing that with us.
How could they be how could they be so cruel to their father? Would you do this to your father? Would I do that? That's a horrible thing.
But the very fact that they contemplated selling a brother, and by the way, that's why the Torah keeps, in my opinion, why the Torah keeps it everything of confusion. That Midianites, Yishmaelim, Egypt, who's selling who? Why is that? The Torah purposely wants to shroud it in a mystery, because even if they didn't sell him directly, they were still responsible for what happened.
Very painful episode, but it's also painful for us how we view them, because it's not the way to speak and behave normally.
It's not a way to behave, and by the way, and that's why it's very appropriate for Tisha B'Av, where you read about the 10 Asara Harugei Malchus, the 10 sages that were killed, and it all revolves around the selling of Joseph by the brothers, where the emperor says there's never been a collection of sages such as you, and therefore he executes them for the selling of Joseph, even though it's the time frame is some of them were at the time of Bar Kokhba revolt, some of them at the time of the temple. But I think it's just teaching us a lesson that when we have hatred for one another, it leads to all kinds of problems that takes generations to cure.
They may have been Gogulim. They may have been the brothers themselves.
Okay.
The Gemara.
There are many ways.
Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz, the great rabbi of Frankfurt, Prague, and Jerusalem, in his book Shnei Luchas Habris, says they were reincarnations of the 10 tribes. The interesting question is Rabbi Akiva, because there were only nine brothers who sold Joseph, and yet 10 sages who were murdered. But it was only 9, and he says something incredibly powerful.
Reuben didn't want to sell it.
No, but you're talking about Binyamin wasn't there.
Binyamin wasn't there, and Yosef, of course, was the victim. So you only had 9 brothers involved in the sale.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
So why were there 10 Jews, 10 sages that were slain?
So what's
the Shalos says something very intense. He says, this is very heavy. He says that it says that the Shvatim wanted a minion. So who did they add as a 10th?
Yeah, go ahead.
They added Hashem. In other words, they felt that they were doing God's work, and Rabbi Akiva was a convert who's considered a child of God directly because he doesn't come from the lineage of the Jewish people, and that was Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Shimshon Astropoler, who was killed in the 1648 Khmelnytsky pogroms, Gimel of 1648, Rabbi Shimshon Astropoler, the great Polish Kabbalist and sage, says that at the end of Bechul Koiseh we speak about Koil Asher Yaver Tachas Hashevet Hashavet Ha'asiri Yeh Kodesh Lashem. Incredibly, he interprets that whole verse that each one of the 9 sages killed was Tachas Hashevet, was corresponding one of the brothers, one of the tribes. The 10th one, Rabbi Akiva, is Kodesh Lashem.
How interesting. Wasn't his father the Ger? Wasn't it his father? His father.
The Rambam, Maimonides, in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, writes that he was his father Yosef, Akiva ben Yosef. His father was a Ger Tzedek.
Yeah, his father, not him.
No, but I think that some say that he also was a.
Some say himself was a Ger. In fact, it's censored in many of our Gemaras, but in Sanhedrin, Sadegvav, there's a version that Rabbi Akiva was a descendant of Sisera. Sisera was one of the greatest arch enemies of the Jewish people, and he was a descendant of Sisera.
According to Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, I believe he's a descendant. He came from Amalek.
And Rav Meir was a descendant of Nero, who was a descendant of Asa.
Right.
So I mean, you have that.
The Talmud does say, "Bnei Banav Shel Haman."
Lomdu Torah Bnei Brak, and who represents Bnei Brak? Rabbi Akiva, right?
Right.
That's what Shlomo Aviner writes in one of his forum, and that's Rabbi Akiva. So obviously he was somebody who was very, very special, and and look, and he was one of the 10 that were killed by the Romans. And I just find his whole lifestyle, maybe just to digress for a moment, Rabbi Jacobson, his life was so interesting, where he was poor and he learned, and his wife sent him away to learn, but yet he inherited fortunes from his father-in-law, and also he married the widow of Turnus Rufus. He got another treasure from that too.
He was Megayer. And by the way, I hate to say this, but looking from the Roman point of view, being the devil's advocate, he was a supporter of, Rabbi Akiva was a supporter of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So the Romans considered him an arch enemy. You have to understand that point of view, that he was a supporter of Bar Kokhba, Rabbi Akiva, and that's the Romans considered. That's why they killed him. You got it?
Rabbi Jacobson, you want to comment to that?
No, listen, Rabbi Akiva, the Rambam famously says Rabbi Akiva was the Nosei Kalim. He was a great, great supporter of Bar Kokhba. We know that from the Gemara. But you have to understand that the revolt of Bar Kokhba came, the cruelty and the mercilessness of the Romans knew no bounds. So it's very important to understand this.
I'm just telling you how the Romans viewed him.
But they didn't have any excuse. Anyway, Yaakov, thank you. They didn't have any excuse.
The crucifixions, what they did, the torturing of men and women and children.
Horrible.
You read Josephus and you read the Midrashim. You read the history books. It's the fact that we survived and we're here today and the Roman Empire is gone is really, despite all the pain that we went through, it's
yet they produced many Gerim, Onkelos, and the Romans produced many Gerim at that time. Isn't that funny? It's an oddity. You know that.
And Onkelos, right? Onkelos was his uncle was Titus of Russia.
Exactly. And many Romans they fell away. They came over to the Nero converted. Okay. That's why the Rome burnt while Nero filled. He disappeared. Okay, there you go.
All right, Yaakov, thank you so much. Have an easy fast. In the few moments we have remaining, Rabbi Jacobson, I just saw an incredible thought from Rabbi Nachman Kahana, the rabbi of the Young Israel, the old city of Jerusalem. And according to the Gemara, the Babylonian invaders invaded the temple on a Sunday. and the Levium made a mistake. Instead of saying the Psalm of the day, Shir Shel Yom, of Sunday, they said the Psalm of Wednesday. Ditto in the Second Temple, when the Roman invaders came in, they made a mistake and didn't say the Shir Shel Yom of Sunday, but said the one on Wednesday. Most common thought would be because on Wednesday the Psalm talks about God of vengeance. However, Rabbi Nachman Kana said that at the moment when the Kohanim and the Levium were losing the temple, they were given a vision. And he said that the answer to this question was in 1967, because the Israeli forces took over the Temple Mount on a Wednesday. So at the moment when they were losing the temple, they were given a vision when the temple be once again in Jewish hands.
Wow. Fascinating.
Any closing thoughts?
I would just mention, you mentioned this to me on Friday. I went Friday to a funeral of a teacher of mine. I thought it would be worthwhile to mention his name. His name was Rabbi Yoel Kahn. And in the Chabad world, he was considered one of the senior, if not its most senior, scholar and scribe. And he died at the age of 91 this past Thursday, and he was buried a few feet away from the late Lubavitcher Rebbe in the Montefiore Cemetery in Queens. And it's just interesting to note because he grew up in Russia, and then he moved to Israel in the 30s as a little kid. And then he came by boat from Israel to New York in 1950. What he did not know was that he left the shores of Haifa the morning after the death of the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe in 1950. They didn't know the news yet. He didn't know the news. So they went off on boat, and when they came to America 2 weeks later, they found out that the Lubavitcher Rebbe has passed away. So the purpose of their coming seemed in vain. So he consulted with the man who would become the future Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendelschneis, and should he just go back to Israel, to his parents, to his community, to his yeshiva. And the Rebbe told him, listen, my father-in-law, the Rebbe told you to come. He knew what's going to happen, and he told you to come, so you should stay. And as it turned out, that as the new Lubavitcher Rebbe assumed leadership, Rabbi Yoel Kahn stood there and literally memorized and transcribed almost every single talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe over the next 42 years until 1992 when the Rebbe took ill. And maybe with the exception of one Farbrengen that he missed, I don't think he missed ever a Shabbos or holiday address or talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So really for the Chabad world and everybody affected by the Chabad world, his death on Thursday is like really the end of an era.
Wow. No, he certainly was. Now, didn't you also transcribe some of the lectures of the Lubavitcher Rebbe?
So Rabbi Yoel Kahn, who died at 91, he was like the chief oral scribe, but every few years he would gather around him a group of yeshiva students that he felt were academically and intellectually suited for this job. So my brother, Simon Jacobson, was part of that team, and when I came of age, I also joined that team. And that was the last few years of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's talks. But he was what's called the chief chayzer, which means he was like the chief oral scribe. These were oral scribes because the Lubavitcher Rebbe would speak for hours on Shabbos and holidays, and obviously there were no recording devices because it's Shabbos and holidays, and the Rebbe could speak for hours and hours and hours, and these were profound presentations on all parts of Torah and Judaism, very, very scholastic. So he really was a brilliant man, and the team had this responsibility and privilege of memorizing everything and transcribing everything, and from this you have the 100 or 200 volumes of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's teachings.
Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson is our guest. You know what? Let's just go for a few minutes more when we come back. Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, as you heard, is a noted scholar, a lecturer. He speaks around the world, and whether mysticism is a specialty, but he knows all aspects of Judaism, has to deal with all kinds of questions. He started the yeshiva.net. When we come back, we'll try to take a couple more of your phone calls.
And now your host.
Keep it locked right here.
Talkline radio and TV with Zev Brenner is just phenomenal. Everybody concerned about the Jewish community should listen and watch. He has the best guests. He asks the most interesting questions. He's always so well prepared. It's talk radio and television from a Jewish point of view at its very best.
To advertise on the Talkline network and Talkline's email and social media blasts reaching over 70,000 people, please call 212-769-1925, extension 100. That's 212-769-1925, extension 100. Or email info@talklinenetwork.com.
You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981. You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
Our final stretch, Rabbi Y. Jacobson is our guest. We're looking at Tisha B'Av and what we should be commemorating and some of the things that we should really be thinking about on this a very, very sad day on the Jewish calendar, which, as we said at the beginning, it has all elements of positivity. It's going to be called a holiday. But right now we have to live, I guess, with the fact that it's a mourning day, a very, very sad day on the Jewish calendar. Maybe, Rabbi Jacobson, you get lots of different questions from different people. What's some of the common questions you've gotten regarding Tisha B'Av?
I was once speaking to a group of teenagers. It was during the 9 days. You can hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can. Go ahead. Yes.
And they were very perturbed by the fact that they couldn't eat meat. They wanted to eat meat. They wanted to have some rib steak. And this was an Orthodox Jewish camp. And they couldn't eat meat. They were very upset. And, one of the boys, smart kid, he's like, I don't understand. This thing happened 1,900 years ago. And yes, it's sad and it's tragic. But why in the world, in the 21st century, I want to eat a piece of steak? I want to drink a cup of wine. Why do I have to suffer? What's the logic here? It just makes me miserable. It makes me feel like I don't like this whole religion. This is what he's sharing. And it was certainly an interesting question to ponder because, for all of us who grew up in camp, we always knew the 9 days were always difficult days, right? We didn't go swimming, and there were no trips, and they had to invent all these types of entertainments, and of course the music stopped playing in camp. It was just an element of a somber, solemn element. And as kids, you go away this summer, you want to have fun. It's like, why do we have to bear the burdens? Like, not enough Jewish suffering.
I think purposely the 9 days and the 3 weeks are in the summertime. It's not any other time. I think it's made because summertime people are more into frivolous activities and going away. So maybe it's to bring a somber note during this time period.
Right. So as somebody once told me, we finally have a few weeks in the summer.
Right.
We could relax. They had to ruin that. So I looked at these kids and I said, it's a good question. It's an important question. And I'm just going to share with you one thought. And I saw that it resonated. It resonated with them. And I said, listen, I just want you to understand what we're doing right now. We live almost 2,000 years later, literally. What happened over the last 2,000 years? What happened? Everything changed. I mean, the changes in terms of civilization on our planet in the last 2,000 years were incredible. I mean, the changes in the last 100 years are mind-boggling. Never mind the last 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years. America is a few hundred years old. French Revolution, a few hundred years. And you're dealing here with a people that's thousands of years old. And I said, listen, we could ignore what happened, and we can eat meat, and we can drink wine, and we can take haircuts, and we can enjoy water sports and so forth. But I want you to know the gift you would be giving up. The gift that you would be giving up is a link to a story that began 4,000 years ago, and it's still going strong. You could look at yourself as an isolated young man or woman growing up in the United States of America, trying to create a life for yourself. Or you could see yourself in the context of an eternal and timeless people that for thousands of years has survived through thick and thin, through every conceivable crisis and tragedy. and yet emerged with strong families and a strong identity and strong values, with a vision to transform the landscape of planet Earth, literally, to fill this world with divine awareness like the water covers the sea. A nation that in every generation attracted the hate and the venom of the most evil and heinous dictators, tyrants, despots, cruel monarchs and governors, as it still attracts the venom of those people, whether in Iran or Syria or Afghanistan or Pakistan, etc., Gaza. It tells you about the power of this people, the sacredness of the people, the holiness of the people. A people that literally in every generation stood at the forefront of the moral voice, the moral conversation, leading and inspiring the moral conversation of mankind. And I said, I look at this custom not to eat meat as basically a statement. We're not living in a vacuum. We are continuing a story. The Jews who were murdered 2,000 years ago are living in us. They're living in our shuls, in our study halls, in our homes, in our minds, in our texts, in our conversations. And during those 9 days, when they were slain mercilessly, I could make believe like nothing happened. It's 2,000 years comfortably in America. We can all eat steak with ketchup and French fries and add some sushi and a cup of wine. But I say, you know what? I would prefer to say, no, these 9 days are meaningful to me, because when my ancestors suffered so much during these 9 days, I'm alive, thank God we're alive. But you know what? I won't touch that piece of steak just to pay tribute to all those Jews and say that I will continue their story. And I said, I think that powerful connection, it's worth to maintain it, even if I have to sacrifice a rib steak for supper.
Now,
you know what?
And what did they say?
They were like, their applause. They gave me such an applause, and I realized, Herman Wouk. You remember Herman Wouk, the late
the great writer.
Yeah, right. So Herman Wouk in the 1950s once tells Lubavitcher Rebbe, of blessed memory, to Lubavitcher Rebbe, I'm listening to your vision for American Jews. Do you think you're dreaming? Do you think you can tell American Jews to do anything? This is the 1950s. And the Rebbe tells them, Mr. Wouk, he says, American youth, you can't tell them to do anything. You can explain to them to do everything. And I realized that when we speak to the souls of our children, they get it. I could have told them, you're just a bunch of spoiled brats. This is the law in Shulchan Aruch, and just listen to your elders and stop asking stupid, bratty, narcissistic questions. And then they would have said, okay, another one, another rabbi who doesn't understand us. But when I spoke to their souls, to their idealism, they were in. They got it. It was very moving for me to see that.
Tell me, in the few moments we have remaining, I know that we carry the Siyum every day from the National Committee for the Friends of Jewish Education, but from what I understand, Lubavitch is not big in having meat Siyum, where you have here a Siyum and eat meat. Because you can do it. You can do it every day. I mean, you can have a Siyum and have meat every day. So there's a way of getting around it.
I live here in Muncie, and I have two neighbors, and they made a Siyum on different nights, and they had huge parties with meat and wine. It happens to be that the custom of the fifth Chabad Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Shalom Ber Shneis, and the Rebbe Rashab, he died in 1920, he had a custom of making a Siyum every night, but he still would not eat meat and wine. This was his stringency that became part of Chabad tradition. But that's just a particular stringency. Halachically, you're allowed to eat meat. And that's what they do in many camps and in many communities.
Right. So maybe the solution the point is that you're teaching them a lesson. That's what you're trying to teach them.
I would say they have a lesson. That's number one. And number two, it's the idea that even when they're eating meat with a Siyum, they're eating meat because, in a way, that Siyum, the fact that they finished the tractate of Gemara, is really the defeat of the destruction. It's the defeat of Rome. It's the defeat of Babylonia. The fact that Jews are learning Gemara today. What are the chances, right? An Aramaic text composed 1,700 years ago. The syntax, the structure, the grammar, the language, the style, completely alien to the sensibilities and to the flavors and to the laws of literature and the styles of literature of the 21st century. And And yet thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of Jews pick up the text and they discuss it and they learn it and they argue and they ask and they answer and they finish it and they make a siyum. That itself represents Netzach Yisrael, the eternity of Israel, and the defeat of those forces that undermine and destroy the Beis HaMikdash. You know, the Talmud says in Gittin that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the leading sage of the time, he met Vespasian. And Vespasian was impressed by him, and he asked him what he would like as a favor. And Rabbi Yochanan asked him three things: a doctor for Reb Tzadok, and to spear the dynasty of Ram Gamliel, and also to spear the city of Yavna, where there was the yeshiva, the Sanhedrin, the yeshiva. And people were critical of him. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yosef, they said, you should have asked him for the temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai thought that would be ineffective, so he just asked him for Yavna. But one of the fascinating things is that through that, really, Rome signed its own death certificate. Vespasian didn't realize that by giving Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai permission to keep the Torah alive in Yavna, he was guaranteeing the timeless eternity of the Jewish people. So this very same man who burned Jerusalem, Vespasian and his son Titus, who did everything we're mourning today, came from Vespasian and Titus. He was the same man who also ultimately wrote the death sentence of the Roman Empire and the certificate of survival for the Jewish people.
Except they reneged on it. They reneged on it because they tried to eradicate the study of Torah by 60 years later. That's supposed to lead to the Bar Kokhba revolt, where they revolted against the excesses of the Roman barbarism, but also stopping. So they went back on it.
Exactly. That the Talmud says the Sanhedrin had to move into 10 different locations, go into exile, and ultimately it was dissolved. But obviously the learning was not. And the fact is, that it's really incredible. It's incredible. Rabbi Akiva was murdered. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was murdered. Literally, Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol was murdered. Rabbi Hanina ben Chadian was murdered. Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, the 10th. And yet we learn their teachings. Rabbi Akiva's ideas are on the lips of every Jewish child.
It means which means he's still alive. He's still alive. Rabbi Roger, we're out of time, so we appreciate your really being with, giving us some great insight into Tisha B'Av. People can go to the yeshiva.net.
Thank you. My honor and privilege.
And
my honor and privilege. And may we spoke about the seeds of redemption. So the birth of Mashiach on Tisha B'Av. So after so many years, may we experience that birth in a very real and vivid way, personally and cosmically.
Amen, amen. Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, noted R-rated scholar, and you can catch him at yeshiva.net.
Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thank you for listening to today's episode.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.